In the summer of 1943, the British High Command looked at the American Army with a mixture of skepticism and condescension. They saw a force untested, green, and in their eyes, only fit to protect the flanks, hold positions, and follow instructions. To the British generals, America's soldiers were amateurs, useful in secondary roles, but incapable of leading the decisive battles that would win the war. It was in Sicily that this perception would be challenged, in a campaign designed to showcase British expertise and relegate the Americans to supporting roles. Yet, one American general had other ideas. George Patton, newly restored to command after the humiliation at Kasserine Pass, had spent months rebuilding not only the credibility of his forces, but the reputation of the United States Army itself. He would not allow the British to sideline American troops in a display of their own glory. On the morning of the 17th of August, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard's 3rd Battalion of the 15th Infantry Regiment entered the port city of Messina, Sicily. The Americans had arrived first. They fanned out through the streets, securing strategic positions, raising their flags above the city, and asserting their presence. Hours later, a British patrol from Montgomery's 8th Army arrived, expecting to claim what they assumed was their prize. They found the Americans already in position, relaxed, confident, leaning against walls, smoking, holding the keys to the city they believed would be theirs. The silence that greeted the British officers was deafening. It spoke louder than any formal victory speech ever could. The Americans had beaten the British at their own game, and the world would see it. This was not merely a contest between two generals. It was the moment the United States Army proved it had shed its role as Britain's junior partner. The campaign that brought them to this point began with Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, the first major assault on Axis-held Europe. For months, British and American planners had labored under the supervision of General Harold Alexander, commander of the 15th Army Group. Alexander was a Briton of impeccable experience and impeccable caution. In his headquarters of over 160 staff officers, only 12 were American. It was a British show, carefully orchestrated, a stage set for Montgomery to claim the spotlight while Americans waited in the wings. The operational plan was methodical, textbook, and designed to highlight British precision. Montgomery would land his forces on the southeastern beaches and advance north along the main highway, Route 124, to capture Messina. It was the shortest path, with the best roads and coastal terrain, and the route that would bring glory to the British 8th Army. Patton's 7th Army, however, was assigned a supporting role. They would land west of the British beaches, protect the flank, and ensure no German forces threatened Montgomery's advance from the west. The plan assumed that the British would face the fiercest resistance, while the Americans would guard the periphery, watch, learn, and follow. Montgomery's planning documents estimated the advance would take 6 to 8 weeks. Each stage would be meticulously prepared. Forces would be built up to overwhelming strength before every engagement. Casualties would be minimized through slow, deliberate progress. It was the embodiment of Montgomery's doctrine: methodical, cautious, professional. Patton, however, saw the plan for what it truly was. The British had reserved the spotlight for themselves, relegating American forces to observers. He was not about to let months of painstaking work and the restoration of American credibility be squandered in the name of British prestige. He studied the terrain, the maps, and the dispositions. He saw opportunities the British did not. If his troops moved faster, if they leveraged audacity over caution, they could seize objectives before Montgomery did. The main highway, Route 124, had been stolen from him, assigned exclusively to British forces under the guise of operational necessity. Patton saw it for what it was: a personal insult, a deliberate act to keep Americans in supporting roles. On the 10th of July, 1943, the D-Day landings of Operation Husky began. Allied forces stormed the southern shores of Sicily. Montgomery's British and Canadian troops landed on the southeastern beaches, advancing steadily north. Syracuse fell by the 11th, Augusta by the 13th. British progress was careful, relentless, and cautious. Patton's American forces landed west of them at Gela and Lata. Despite rough seas and scattered airborne drops, the landings were a success. The Americans established beachheads, defeated local Italian and German defenses, and began their assigned mission of securing the western flank. Yet Patton could see that the western part of the island was lightly defended. There were no major German formations to resist them. His soldiers, large in number, were sitting idle, guarding a flank that had little need for protection. By the 14th of July, the pattern of British caution was evident. Montgomery advanced slowly, halting whenever he encountered resistance to prepare overwhelming force for the next attack. Every day spent preparing allowed the Germans time to strengthen defenses. Meanwhile, Patton's forces remained poised, ready, but restricted by orders. He approached Alexander with a proposal to take the western part of Sicily, advance to Palermo, seize ports, and then turn east toward Messina. Alexander hesitated. Officially, Patton's mission was to support Montgomery, not initiate independent operations. But the opportunity was clear. Alexander gave ambiguous approval, allowing Patton to conduct reconnaissance and exploit opportunities. It was a green light for action if he dared. On the 19th of July, Patton unleashed the 7th Army in an audacious advance that would go down in history. His objective was Palermo, the capital of northwestern Sicily, over 100 miles through rugged, mountainous terrain. The route Montgomery's planners estimated would take weeks was covered in 72 hours. The 3rd Infantry Division, under Major General Lucian Truscott, led the advance, supported by the 2nd Armored Division and elements of the 82nd Airborne. They moved day and night. Engineers blasted new roads when terrain became impassable. Tanks bypassed resistance, pressing forward relentlessly. Truscott's troops, trained in rapid marching, maintained an unprecedented pace. The American advance was a lunge, a relentless push through furnace-like terrain. Soldiers bled, marched on minimal rest, and fought whenever necessary. Yet they saw progress, a tangible reward for their endurance. By the 22nd of July, Palermo had fallen. The speed of the advance stunned even seasoned Allied observers. Over 100 miles covered in 3 days through harsh terrain, thousands of prisoners taken, and massive supplies captured. Montgomery's forces, still grinding along the eastern coast, could hardly keep pace. Press headlines in America celebrated Patton's triumph, while British papers downplayed its significance. To the public, the message was clear. The American army was no longer secondary. Perfect. Let's continue the story. Diving into the high-stakes amphibious maneuvers, the relentless race toward Messina, and the mounting tension between Patton and Montgomery. This section will further expand the suspense and bring us deeper into the 8,500 word target. By the 1st of August, 1943, both armies were converging on Sicily's northeastern coast. Montgomery's forces pressed north along Route 124, methodical as always, pausing at every strong point to ensure overwhelming force before proceeding. Patton's 7th Army approached from the west, moving along less favorable roads, but with momentum that even the most cautious British planners could not match. The island itself was a cauldron of heat and dust. its mountains jagged and unforgiving, roads carved from rock and ancient paths barely wide enough for tanks to pass. Supply lines were tenuous, communication lines stretched to their limits, and every mile brought the men closer to exhaustion. Yet Patton refused to slow. Every day his soldiers pressed forward, they inched toward history, and every day Montgomery advanced cautiously, calculating, hesitant, leaving the door open for American audacity to overtake British planning. Patton's strategy was audacious, bordering on reckless by conventional military standards. He saw the northern coast of Sicily, dotted with beaches, as a way to bypass German defensive positions that Montgomery would inevitably confront head-on. Using improvised amphibious assaults, Patton would leapfrog his forces ahead, striking where the enemy was unprepared, forcing retreats, and capturing key points before the British could react. On the 8th of August, the first of these amphibious operations landed at Sant'Agata. American troops came ashore behind German lines, quickly consolidating positions, cutting off retreats, and forcing local defenders to abandon prepared positions. 3 days later, on the 11th of August, the second landing at Brolo nearly ended in disaster. The 2nd Battalion of the 30th Infantry found itself dangerously isolated, facing counterattacks from German forces before the main American column could link up. The battalion fought desperately, holding their ground through relentless assaults until reinforcements arrived. Supplies were low, men were exhausted, yet the American officers maintained discipline under chaos. The success of the operation hinged not only on courage, but on sheer ingenuity and audacity. Qualities Patton had demanded and his soldiers had delivered. By the 16th of August, the final landing at Spatafora went unopposed. German forces were already evacuating, their retreat hastened by Patton's continuous pressure and unpredictable maneuvers. Montgomery, upon hearing of these operations, was livid. Here was the very recklessness he despised, the audacity that he believed endangered troops unnecessarily. For Montgomery, war was a science, a series of calculated moves to minimize risk while achieving strategic objectives. Patton's approach, by contrast, was a blur of speed and aggression. Yet, Montgomery could not ignore the results. Patton was closing in on Messina faster than anyone had anticipated. By the 14th of August, Montgomery launched his own amphibious operation, attempting to match the American tactics. British troops landed near Scaletta, 12 miles south of Messina, and began a rapid push to regain ground. But fatigue, slower movement, and cautious planning meant that the British advance could not match the Americans' pace. Patton's forces were already 3 miles from Messina by the 16th of August, while Montgomery's remained 15 miles out. The die was cast. Barring disaster, Messina would be in American hands before the British arrived. The 17th of August arrived, blazing hot over the Sicilian coastline. Early in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard's 3rd Battalion entered Messina. American flags rose over the port city, and soldiers moved swiftly to secure key points. There was no dramatic confrontation. The Germans had already evacuated during the night, slipping across the straits to mainland Italy. The significance of the moment was not in defeating the enemy. It was in being first. The Americans had beaten the British to Messina, proving capability, speed, and audacity on a scale Montgomery had not anticipated. When the British 4th Armored Brigade arrived later that day, they found Americans already in control. Montgomery himself, in a rare act of understated protest, avoided a formal handover ceremony, refusing to give Patton the satisfaction of witnessing his embarrassment. Patton, ever theatrical, greeted the British officers with exaggerated courtesy. He thanked them for their contributions, offered to brief them on local conditions, and emphasized American achievements in a display that was both gracious and pointed. The message was unmistakable. The United States Army was no longer a subordinate force. American soldiers had crossed more difficult terrain, covered greater distances, and arrived first. The British press tried to spin the outcome, claiming that Montgomery had faced tougher German resistance, that Patton's route was easier, and that Messina itself was not strategically decisive. American papers made no such claims. They celebrated the speed, aggression, and effectiveness of Patton's army. German commanders, observing the campaign from their positions in retreat and later through post-war reports, drew stark comparisons. General Hans Valentin Hube noted that Montgomery's approach was predictable. Methodical buildups, systematic attacks, consolidation after each advance. Defending against him was a mathematical exercise, a series of calculations that allowed German forces to anticipate and counter British movements. Patton, by contrast, was dangerously unpredictable. He attacked when doctrine demanded rest, bypassed strong points rather than reducing them methodically, and launched operations without adequate supplies, making them work through improvisation and sheer audacity. Field Marshal Albert Kessler, overseeing German forces in Italy, reached the same conclusion. British forces were competent, but American forces under Patton were aggressive, inventive, and far harder to contain. General Fridolin von Enghel, responsible for Sicilian defenses, described defending against Montgomery as managing a known problem, but defending against Patton was a continuous emergency. To the Germans, Montgomery was respected. Patton was feared. Montgomery's response to the defeat was revealing. He claimed the race had never existed, that both armies had achieved their objectives, and that his forces had faced heavier resistance along the eastern coast. He insisted the Americans had only moved through areas of minimal German opposition, that reaching Messina a few hours earlier was irrelevant. Yet his private complaints betrayed his true feelings. Patton had grandstanded, taken unnecessary risks, and stolen glory meant for British forces. Behind the scenes, Montgomery's staff reminded him of the metrics. Patton's forces, despite longer routes, difficult terrain, and high operational tempo, had suffered roughly 10,000 casualties, compared to 12,800 sustained by the British Eighth Army. By every tangible measure, Patton had executed the more effective campaign. The feud between Patton and Montgomery, ignited in Sicily, would poison Anglo-American operations for the remainder of the war. The rivalry, once professional, became intensely personal. In Normandy, during the Battle of the Bulge, and in subsequent drives into Germany, both generals remembered Messina. Their staff officers clashed over supplies, logistics, and priorities. Aggressive American tactics repeatedly outpaced British caution, proving that audacity, speed, and initiative could achieve more with fewer resources than methodical planning alone. Yet, every subsequent operation was tinged with mistrust, competition, and the memory of who had arrived first. Sicily's lessons extended beyond the personalities involved. They demonstrated the impact of speed, audacity, and willingness to take calculated risks. Patton's 72-hour drive to Palermo and the subsequent race to Messina showcased that doctrine could be challenged, that initiative at the operational level could produce outsized results, and that a commander who understood his troops' capabilities could outperform even the most cautious and experienced adversaries. German commanders' assessments reinforced this lesson. To them, Montgomery was professional but predictable, Patton was dangerous and unpredictable. Allied intelligence took note, influencing strategic decisions in Italy and beyond. Patton's performance validated his approach and forced Allied command to reconcile the tension between British caution and American aggression. Yet, the victory came at a cost. While Patton and Montgomery competed for headlines and prestige, the Germans executed Operation Largo, evacuating over 100,000 men and 10,000 vehicles across the straits to mainland Italy. The Allies, distracted by each other's movements, failed to close the trap. The operation was a triumph of speed, audacity, and tactical skill. But it also highlighted the dangers of internal rivalry, overshadowing strategic objectives. Perfect. Let's continue and dive into the aftermath, the fallout between Patton and Montgomery, and the strategic consequences of Sicily, keeping the same suspense and narrative depth. The morning after American forces entered Messina, the city was alive with a different kind of energy. Soldiers moved through the streets, securing positions, organizing supply depots, and ensuring communication lines were functional. War correspondents crowded the port, eager to capture the moment that had become symbolic of a new reality. The United States Army was no longer a junior partner in Allied operations. Headlines across American newspapers shouted victory, emphasizing Patton's lightning advance, the audacity of the amphibious maneuvers, and the 72-hour dash that had stunned both allies and enemies alike. Meanwhile, British newspapers attempted to spin the narrative differently. They highlighted Montgomery's methodical approach, the challenges of the eastern coastal route, and the heavier German resistance he had faced. In carefully worded reports, they suggested that American success in Messina was flashy, perhaps even reckless, but ultimately secondary to the strategic victories along Route 124. For Montgomery, appearances mattered. He needed to preserve the reputation of British forces and his own authority as a senior commander. Publicly, he praised the Americans for their contribution, but privately, the frustration was palpable. To Montgomery, Patton's actions were reckless, a dangerous show of speed and bravado that threatened the careful calculations that had defined British operations for decades. Within the Allied command, the implications of Sicily's campaign became immediately clear. Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff noted that Patton's army had achieved more in less time, with fewer casualties relative to the distance covered, than the British Eighth Army. While Montgomery's forces had faced heavier opposition, the methodical approach left German defenders sufficient time to withdraw, regroup, and establish defensive positions further inland. Patton's aggressive drive had forced the enemy to react continuously, disrupting German plans and creating opportunities for further exploitation. Operationally, the Americans had proven that speed and audacity could be force multipliers in ways that traditional doctrine often underestimated. German commanders, observing from the rear, reached their own conclusions. Reports circulated within the Wehrmacht describing Patton as a commander who was unpredictable, aggressive, and willing to operate beyond conventional limitations. Hube's assessment remained blunt. Montgomery was a known quantity, capable of precise planning and methodical execution, but predictable. Patton, by contrast, forced the Germans to respond to threats that appeared suddenly and in unexpected locations. Kessler's reports reinforced this view, noting that American operations required constant adaptation and imposed psychological pressure on German forces far greater than the cautious British advance. Even field reports from smaller unit commanders, those who had faced Patton's rapid advance in Sicily, echoed the same sentiment. Fighting against him was a continuous emergency, a test of endurance, ingenuity, and courage. Within the American command, Patton's reputation soared. Eisenhower and his staff understood the importance of balancing boldness with operational prudence, and Sicily had validated Patton's approach. The 72-hour dash to Palermo and the subsequent race to Messina became textbook examples of how speed, initiative, and audacity could achieve results unattainable through traditional methodical planning. Patton himself documented the campaign meticulously, emphasizing that the combination of careful preparation, aggressive execution, and a willingness to exploit opportunities on the fly had made the difference. He noted, too, the importance of morale. Soldiers inspired by trust and confidence in their leadership could achieve remarkable feats, even under extreme fatigue and adverse conditions. Montgomery, in contrast, grew increasingly defensive. After the conclusion of Sicily, he authored after-action reports emphasizing British accomplishments, framing the campaign as a victory defined by strategic success, despite the Americans' early arrival in Messina. In interviews, he highlighted the heavier German resistance faced by the Eighth Army, downplayed the significance of Patton's achievements, and insisted that operational timelines were always estimates, flexible in execution. Privately, he expressed deep resentment, convinced that Patton had undermined the British effort, stolen the glory, and demonstrated a form of initiative that, in Montgomery's eyes, bordered on insubordination. This feud would cast a long shadow over subsequent operations. In Normandy, during the Battle of the Ytre Bulge, and in campaigns across Italy and Germany, the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery influenced planning, logistics, and coordination. Staff officers found themselves navigating the tension between American audacity and British caution, balancing operational effectiveness against interpersonal rivalries. Yet the metrics were undeniable. When given the freedom to act aggressively, American forces often achieved faster victories at lower costs than their cautious British counterparts. Every officer, from private to general, understood that Sicily had been more than a test of speed. It had been a revelation of operational philosophy. The strategic consequences were profound. While Patton and Montgomery jockeyed for position, German forces executed Operation Largo, evacuating over 100,000 men and 10,000 vehicles from Sicily to the Italian mainland. The Allies, focused on their internal rivalry, missed the opportunity to trap the retreating enemy. The Sicilian campaign demonstrated the duality of victory: tactical and operational success on one hand, and missed opportunities due to inter-allied competition on the other. For Patton, the lesson was clear: audacity, initiative, and a willingness to accept calculated risks could outmatch traditional caution, but only when combined with decisive leadership and relentless momentum. German assessments continued to influence Allied strategy. Reports from field commanders emphasized that Patton's approach forced the enemy into reactive positions, disrupted defensive planning, and imposed psychological stress. Montgomery's methodical planning, while professionally competent, allowed the Germans to anticipate moves and manage withdrawals effectively. Allied intelligence absorbed these insights, shaping future operations in Italy, France, and eventually Germany. Patton's methods became a model for mobile warfare, emphasizing flexibility, speed, and aggressive exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Yet, the personal consequences for Patton and Montgomery remained significant. Sicily had cemented a professional and personal rivalry that would endure for the remainder of the war. Montgomery never forgave Patton for beating him to Messina. In Montgomery's mind, the Americans had acted impulsively, jeopardizing careful planning and demonstrating a level of initiative he considered reckless. Patton, conversely, saw Montgomery's caution as cowardice disguised as professionalism. The race to Messina became a defining moment in both generals' careers, a story repeated in staff rooms, officer messes, and strategy sessions for years to come. The lessons of Sicily extended to operational doctrine. Speed, audacity, and initiative were validated as critical components of modern warfare. Patton's forces had demonstrated that when troops are pushed beyond conventional limits, supported by decisive leadership, they can achieve extraordinary results. The combination of morale, momentum, and aggressive tactics created outcomes that methodical caution alone could not replicate. The Germans had learned this firsthand, and their assessments reinforced the tactical and psychological value of unpredictability in warfare. Sicily also highlighted the dangers of internal rivalry among allies. While Patton and Montgomery competed for glory, the enemy was able to exploit distractions and achieve strategic objectives, such as the evacuation of German forces from Sicily. Coordination, communication, and trust remained vital, but the human element, personal ambition, rivalry, and pride proved equally influential in determining outcomes. Commanders at all levels were forced to reconcile personal differences with strategic imperatives, balancing competition with collaboration in a theater of complex operations. In the end, Sicily's campaign was transformative. Patton's 72-hour dash to Palermo, the race to Messina, and the successful leapfrogging amphibious operations established a new standard for operational tempo, initiative, and the value of audacious leadership. American forces had proven they could act independently, move faster than predicted, and seize objectives even in the face of uncertainty and logistical constraints. Montgomery, despite his careful planning and professional competence, was shown to be limited by predictability and caution. The lessons endured beyond Sicily. In Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the drive into Germany, Patton applied the same principles: speed, audacity, aggressive maneuvering, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses. The rivalry with Montgomery continued to color Allied operations, but the validation of Patton's approach ensured that the United States Army had earned its place not just as an equal partner, but as a force capable of setting the pace of modern warfare. Ultimately, Sicily was more than a campaign. It was a declaration. It was a statement that American soldiers were no longer observers, no longer secondary participants. The 72-hour drive to Palermo and the dramatic race to Messina marked the moment when the United States Army proved it could act decisively, outmaneuver established doctrine, and achieve results that demanded recognition. Patton's actions redefined expectations, shaped perceptions among allies and enemies alike, and set the stage for future victories that would shape the course of World War II.